My name is Melina, and before my 30th birthday, the most exciting moment in my life was when the accounting firm I worked for decided to switch from a PC to a Mac. Yes, this event could hardly claim a place in the headlines, but then it seemed to me that this was a significant change in the routine of my measured life. However, that night, at my friend's party, everything changed. I was standing in the corner of the cramped living room, clutching a soda in my hands, trying to blend in and not draw attention to myself, although I felt awkward in this too tight dress, which, as it seemed to me, emphasized the wrong curves. The music that filled the space was too loud for normal conversation, but it was probably just right for him. Mark. He was taller than most of the people present, and maybe that's why he noticed me. He moved with a kind of natural confidence, casual but not arrogant, the kind that makes your heart stop for a split second before starting to beat with a vengeance again. "Hey, you're Melina, right?" His voice was unexpectedly clear, despite the rumble of the bass. "Yes," I replied, pretending to calmly sip my drink. "You too." He smiled, cocking his head slightly to one side, as if studying me, and then added with a light laugh. "Mark. I saw you. Don't forget if I join you." He didn't wait for my answer, just stood next to me, as if it was a matter of course. "Not at all," I said, realizing that my voice was almost lost in another pop hit blaring from the speakers. "So, Melina, what brings you here tonight?" He leaned closer, and I noticed that despite his light tone, his gaze was attentive, studying, as if he really wanted to know the answer. "Sarah's birthday. Have you known her for a long time?" He nodded. "We went to college together, and she invites me to these parties all the time. I can't say no, can I?" We both laughed, and it sounded easy, natural, as if we had known each other for days. "I'm working with her," I added. "She told me you were, an accountant?" "Numbers are my game," I grinned, although there is rarely anything funny in accounting. "That sounds exciting," he grinned, and it took me a moment to figure out if he was joking or not. "Oh, sure, it's a world of wild parties and high stakes," I played along, and he laughed, appreciating my humor. I suddenly realized that I was enjoying this conversation. Not because he was flirting with me, he wasn't intrusive, but because he seemed to really listen. It was a new feeling. It's exciting. A little scary. "Do you want to get some air?" "What is it?" he asked, nodding towards the exit. I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to escape from this cacophony of sounds and fuss. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, like a sip of water on a sultry day. I took a deep breath, trying to get my thoughts in order, when he spoke again. "So what's a girl like you doing at a party like this?" I looked at him, trying not to show my emotions, and replied with a slight smile. "I just decided to have fun. And maybe get to know someone interesting." "Oh, then you're in luck," he smiled, and funny wrinkles appeared at the corners of his eyes. "I was just looking for someone interesting to spend the evening with." We talked about everything and nothing. About movies, about books, about work. He talked about how he was engaged in graphic design, but got stuck in the corporate field, which annoyed him. It was surprisingly easy for me to be with him, as if we had known each other not for a couple of minutes, but for many years. When the evening was coming to an end, he took out his phone and handed it to me. "Can I have your number? I would really like to see you again." I hesitated. I'm not used to this kind of attention. But there was something right about him, something that made me trust him. "Sure," I said, dialing my number on his phone. He smiled. His face lit up with sincere joy. "Great. I'll call you. It's worth meeting just the two of us." "That sounds good," I said, trying to hide my excitement. I watched him walk away, and a part of me still couldn't believe that this was really my life. Maybe 30 isn't so bad. Maybe it was just the beginning of something truly great. The days after Mark's call seemed blurry, filled with a strange excitement that made me find myself smiling for no reason, standing in line at a cafe or sorting through papers at work, and before I realized how fast time was flying, I was already preparing for our first date, more nervous, which I would like to admit even to myself, because, to be honest, I didn't have much experience in this, and I didn't know how everything should go, but I definitely knew how I wanted to feel: easy, at ease, joyful. I chose a simple blue dress, without unnecessary details, but elegant, modest enough not to seem provocative, and beautiful enough to make me feel confident in it, and although I wasn't sure if it was the right choice, I still didn't have any other option. There was less and less time to think. At exactly 7 o'clock on the dot, as promised, Mark drove up to my house in his car, a well-groomed, clean sedan, without a hint of ostentatious luxury, but it seemed to fully reflect his character, restrained but thorough, and when I got inside, he looked at me and gave me the various smile that seemed to make you feel warmer even on a cool autumn evening. "You look great, Melina," he said, and although there wasn't an ounce of uncertainty in his voice, for some reason I wanted to check if I really looked as good as he said, but when I caught my reflection in the side mirror, I immediately looked away, feeling like my cheeks the heat is rising. "Thanks," I muttered, trying to keep my composure. "You look good too." He smiled, started the engine, and we drove to the restaurant he had chosen, a small, cozy Italian place hidden among tall buildings in the city center, one of those places that is not so easy to get to if you don't know where to look in advance. But as soon as we entered, I understood why he chose it was him. The warm light, the soft hum of conversations, the aroma of fresh pastries and tomato sauce. All this created an atmosphere of coziness and comfort, and despite my initial nerves, I felt better. We ordered pasta. He chose something complicated with an unusual name, and I settled on the classic marinara because my stomach was too preoccupied with anxiety to risk new flavors. But as soon as the dishes arrived and I felt the smells of basil, garlic, and Parmesan mix in the air, I realized that I was hungry. "So, Melina, tell me something about yourself that no one else knows," Mark said, deftly twirling spaghetti on a fork, while looking at me with a slight curiosity, but without pressure, as if he was really interested in getting to know me, and not just filling a pause in the conversation. I grinned, thinking, and, not knowing what else to say, confessed. "I can assemble a Rubik's Cube in less than a minute." He raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "It's pretty cool. You'll have to show it to me sometime." "Sure," I said, starting to relax a little. "Do you have any hidden talents?" He grinned. "I make the best breakfast burrito in the world." "The best in the world?" I asked, playing along with him. "Without a doubt," he confirmed with complete confidence. "Okay," I pretended to consider his words. "Maybe one day you can prove it." He laughed, and the conversation flowed on easily and naturally, and I suddenly realized that for the first time in a long time I feel exactly where I should be. The next few weeks flew by like one bright, eventful day. We saw each other more often. He picked me up after work. We met for lunch near his office. He showed me places in the city that I hadn't noticed before, and I began to look at familiar streets with different eyes, as if for the first time. But I guess I finally realized that things were getting serious when he invited me to meet his parents, Jack and Mary, who lived in a small but cozy house full of photographs, books, and small trinkets that created a sense of warmth and homely comfort. As soon as we entered, Mary immediately came up to me and, without hesitation, hugged me so tightly, as if we had known each other for years. "Oh, we've heard so much about you, darling," she said with a smile, and I felt her hand squeeze my shoulders with a light but confident gesture. I glanced at Mark, and he shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Mom." "She's nice," Mary added, turning to her husband, who was already sitting at the table. "Thanks, Mom," Mark said, and I could tell he was glad. At dinner, the conversation did not stop for a minute. It flowed smoothly, as if we had all been one family for a long time. "So, Melina, Mark tells us that you are an accountant." "This should be interesting," Jack said, handing me the potatoes. I smiled, feeling a slight undertone in his words. Sometimes it happens, but mostly it's just numbers. Although I like the order they create. It's important, he nodded. And your family? Mary asked, genuinely interested. They're fine, thanks. Dad is a businessman, he's always busy, but he's very supportive of me. Everything happened quickly, but it seems so right, as if my whole life had led me to this very moment, to this evening, to these people, to this man who looked at me as if he saw in me not just someone, but exactly who I am. One evening, a few months after the beginning of our romance, we were walking along the riverbank, enjoying the cool air filled with the aromas of water and autumn leaves, and at that moment it seemed to me that life could not be more perfect. Mark was next to me, his warm palm gently squeezing mine, and the city lights were reflected in the surface of the river, creating the feeling that we are inside a living, iridescent postcard, where everything is perfect, every shade, every sound, every breath. Mark slowed his pace, then stopped and turned to me, looking at me with a seriousness that made something inside me tremble. Melina, he said my name softly, almost reverently, as if tasting it before saying something really important. Yes? I felt my heart start to beat faster, because something in his tone, in his gaze made me hold my breath, anticipating the changes. I don't want to wait any longer, he said, squeezing my fingers a little tighter. I know it's fast, but will you marry me? And just like that, in an instant, my world changed. Without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. Yes, I breathed, feeling a smile slip from my lips. Yes, Mark, I will marry you. Whirlwind, as someone would call it from the outside, did not stop there. Almost immediately after we broke the news to our loved ones, Mark met my father, and to my relief, they immediately found common ground. Dad appreciated his directness of manner, his calm confidence, and, of course, his obvious affection for me. He's a good man, Melina, he said when we were alone. You made the right choice. And his approval meant the whole world to me. That's why we got married. The wedding was modest, without frills, but exactly the way we wanted it to be, just close friends and family, a light dinner in a cozy restaurant, quiet music that decorated the evening as well as the flickering candlelight. I even caught myself thinking that I liked the way I looked in a wedding dress, a rare feeling for me, but that day I really felt beautiful, happy, and real. Smiling broadly, I posted several photos on social media, shared my joy with friends and family, but life did not slow down after the wedding. On the contrary, it picked up such a pace that I barely had time to realize what was happening, because one evening, when we were unpacking another box of wedding gifts in our cramped but already beloved apartment, Mark suddenly he said, "Hi, Melina. I've been thinking." I looked at him, waiting for him to continue, but he hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words, then finally deciding, he added, "How about moving in with my parents?" I froze, holding a mug of coffee in my hands, which instantly seemed less warming than before. Live with your parents? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, even though scenes from sitcoms about daughters, in-law forced to share a house with in-laws were already flashing through my head. Mark nodded, looking serious. Yes. They're not getting any younger, and I'd feel better if we were around to help them, plus it would save us some money on rent. I understood that there was logic in his words, but the prospect of moving to my husband's parental home seemed to me too serious. Are you sure they'll want us there all the time? I asked cautiously. Absolutely, he assured me with a smile. Mom's been hinting at this ever since we got engaged. Come on, it's going to be okay. And so, 2 weeks later, we drove up to his parents' house, filled with boxes, bags, and suitcases, and Mary was already waiting for us on the porch, who, when she saw us, waved her hands joyfully, without even waiting for us to get out of the car. "Oh, Melina, we're so glad you're both here," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that turned out to be a little tighter than I expected, and from which I had to restrain myself from coughing. "Welcome home, son," Jack said, patting Mark on the back, and then turned to me. "You too, Melina." I smiled, although I felt a little uneasy inside. The house was cozy, full of old photographs, soft carpets, and furniture that looked as if it hadn't been changed since the 70s, but that was what gave the whole space the charm and warm atmosphere of a family nest, even though I already missed our small but already homely apartment. Mark seemed to notice my doubts, because he leaned over to me and whispered, "Everything's going to be great, you'll see." I nodded, trying to believe it as we carried the boxes inside. The first few days were a real challenge for me. Mary was constantly hanging around, looking into our room, asking if we needed anything, and then, without even waiting for an answer, she continued, excitedly telling me how glad she was that we were now under the same roof, as she had long dreamed of doing. To fill the house with life again, and how pleased she is to take care of us. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable," she chirped, adjusting the pillow on the couch, at the same time pushing the cup of tea closer to me. I tried to keep a smile on my face, but every minute I felt the invasion of our privacy getting stronger, feeling like my space was getting smaller and the boundaries were getting blurrier. One evening, as always, the whole family and I sat down to dinner at a large oak table, which, despite the years, stood as firmly as the relationship in this house, or, as I thought at that time, should have stood. Mark, Jack, Mary, and I were eating meatloaf with mashed potatoes, having a leisurely, even painfully mundane conversation about the weather, the news, and the neighbors, until Mark suddenly dropped another bomb that destroyed the delicate balance of this cozy scene. "So the house needs major repairs," he said, casually cutting off another piece of meat and popping it into his mouth, as if he were talking about something completely insignificant that could be mentioned casually. To my shame, I almost choked on the mashed potatoes, because for the last few months this house has been not just our home, but a whole ordeal for me, and now, when I've just started to get used to life in it, they suddenly announced to me that all this was just a prelude to something else. A bigger one. "Repairs?" I asked, hoping I'd misheard. "Yes," Mark nodded, enthusiastically starting on the side dish. "The roof is in terrible condition, and the plumbing is something from the dark ages." Jack, who had been eating calmly before, now nodded importantly, as if confirming the seriousness of the problem. "We were thinking," Mark continued, and at that moment I noticed how he avoided making eye contact with me, "that maybe we could all chip in on the expenses." I turned my head sharply to Mary, hoping to see the same degree of surprise on her face as on mine, but she suddenly found herself very engrossed in her dinner, as if she had something extremely entertaining on her plate. "All of us?" I asked, hoping Mark would explain what he meant. "Well, I recently got a pay cut at work," he muttered, "so I'm a little tight financially right now. And that's it." I felt a tight knot forming inside me, which made it difficult to breathe. "I'll see what I can do," I managed to squeeze out, although at that moment I wanted to say something completely different, but instead I just gritted my teeth. Mary perked up, her eyes immediately filled with tears, which she apparently did not even try to hide. "Oh, Melina, that would be so useful, you're just an angel, dear," she said, touched, without ceasing to thank me, and at that moment I felt like the words of gratitude sounded like a sentence to me. The next few weeks were spent in an endless cycle of contractors, estimates, meetings with craftsmen, and conversations about which tiles to choose for the bathroom and which wall color would be modern enough, but not too harsh. I wrote out the checks and smiled through gritted teeth, while Mary, beaming with happiness, enthusiastically talked about how wonderful the house looked now, and Jack, pleased, slapped me on the back saying, "You're really part of the family now, Melina." Part of the family. Sure. The part that pays for everything. On one particularly grueling day, after another round of expensive decisions, I literally collapsed on my bed, feeling fatigue rolling in like a heavy wave, squeezing the last of my strength out of me. Mark came into the room, sat down next to me, gently took my hand and, looking into my eyes, said quietly, "Thank you for taking care of all this, Melina." There was something almost sincere in his voice, but it was already hard for me to believe in sincerity when I had spent more than I could afford in recent weeks. "It's okay," I lied, staring at the ceiling, trying not to let my emotions get the better of me. "I just didn't realize how much it would cost." He squeezed my hand, leaned closer, and whispered, "It will all be worth it. It's for the sake of our future, right?" "For the sake of our future," I echoed, although doubt was growing inside me. Whose future are we really building? But there was no turning back. I was so deeply involved in this maelstrom of commitment that I just had to keep going, no matter what it cost me. When the renovation was finally completed, the house really looked great, as if it had stepped out of the pages of an expensive interior magazine. New floors, freshly painted walls, perfect furniture, chosen to create a sense of comfort and luxury at the same time. And despite the financial strain, I felt a little proud, looking around and realizing that this is my merit. We decided to throw a little party to celebrate this event. There were only 4 of us, but the atmosphere was light, filled with laughter, wine, and conversations about the future, until one moment everything changed. We were sitting at the table, finishing our glasses, when Mary suddenly fell silent. The old animation disappeared from her face, and she suddenly looked at Jack, then at Mark and me, and tears appeared in her eyes, but this time not from happiness. "We have something important to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I felt Mark tense up next to me, our gazes met, and in his eyes I saw the same concern that began to rise in me. "What's going on?" I asked, and a familiar heavy knot appeared in my stomach. Jack took a deep breath, then looked away and, as if gathering his courage, said, "The house is mortgaged." For a second, there was silence in the room, so thick that it seemed the air had become thicker. "What?" Mark asked, and I saw his fingers curl into a fist. "The house is heavily mortgaged," Jack repeated slowly, as if each word was difficult for him. "We owe you $200,000. My heart skipped a beat. 200, the words stuck in my throat. "And the bank can take it away if we don't resolve this issue within 2 months, Mary added, her voice trembling, and the first tear rolled down her cheek. I felt something inside of me crumble. The fork clattered onto my plate, but I almost didn't notice it. My head was buzzing, my vision was blurry, and my breathing became heavy and rapid, like before a panic attack. "What do you mean?" My voice sounded louder and sharper than I intended, but at that moment I couldn't control my words or my emotions. "All this renovation that we just paid for, which took all our money." I broke off, looking at Mary, who was already covering her face with her hands, shaking with sobs, and at Jack, who was looking away, unable to withstand my piercing, indignant gaze. "We were ashamed," Mary said through her sobs, her voice trembling like an autumn leaf in the wind. "We thought we could handle it, but after the repairs, after all the expenses, there's just no way." I felt like I was in a bad dream, in a maze from which it was impossible to escape. All the money that I had invested, all the tension, all the sleepless nights spent calculating, it was all for the sake of a house that was not even protected from the bank, a house that could be taken away at any moment. "So what are you saying now?" I repeated, and my voice became prickly, like shards of broken glass. I looked at Mark, hoping to find support in him, but he was looking away, avoiding my eyes, and that made my stomach clench. "Well," he began carefully, obviously choosing his words, "I was hoping, maybe, Melina, that you could talk to your father." I blinked, not believing that I had heard correctly. "Are you serious?" I snapped, feeling a wave of anger rise in me. "If he could help us," Mark was still avoiding my gaze. "Help me?" I repeated, almost sarcastically. "Are you suggesting that I just go and ask my father for $200,000? "It's for us, Melina." Mark finally looked at me, and there was no embarrassment or regret in his eyes, only perseverance. After that, The house will be protected. For us. For the sake of our future. Mary's sobs grew louder. She sobbed convulsively, covering her face with trembling hands, and Jack sighed heavily, as if he was preparing to say something, but changed his mind, and at that moment I suddenly felt like the villain in this crazy family drama. Please, Melina, Mary looked at me pleadingly, her eyes glistening with tears. This is our home, we have spent decades here. I was furious, but the tears and pleading looks exhausted me, and in the end I squeezed out the words that were so expected of me. I'll think about it. I couldn't sleep all night. Mark's words rang in my head, over and over again, until at dawn, huddled in a ball under the covers, I finally made a decision. The next day, I hesitantly called my father. I didn't know how to explain the situation, how to justify my involvement in all this, but to my surprise, he immediately agreed to help, although he put forward one condition. I'll give you the money, Melina, but only with an official agreement and a receipt. I want everything to be documented. When I handed this to Mark, he frowned, his lips pressed into a thin line. Why does everything have to be so official? What is it? He asked irritably, throwing his fork on the table. That's $200,000, Mark. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the anxiety building in my chest. It's a lot of money. He's just being careful. Can't he just trust us? Mark's voice was quieter, but there was tension in his voice. He trusts me, I said, feeling the gap between us grow. He just wants to make sure that everything will be official. Mark gritted his teeth and muttered something under his breath, but after a couple of days the documents were processed and the money was transferred. Mary and Jack didn't stop thanking me, their faces lit up with relief, but something had changed between Mark and me. Coldness appeared in his voice, lightness disappeared from his touch, and there was now some kind of detachment in conversations, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths had begun to diverge. And just when I thought my life couldn't get any darker, tragedy struck with brutal suddenness. Late in the evening, the phone rang. Melina, the voice on the other end, was shaky, full of pain and fear. This is your Aunt Judith. I immediately sat up in bed, clutching the phone in my hand. What happened? I gasped, holding my breath. This is your father, her voice trembled, as if she couldn't believe what she was saying. My heart contracted in a cold premonition. What's wrong with him? He had a heart attack, she said. The world around me seemed to shrink, the ceiling, the walls, everything blurred before my eyes. Is this bad? I didn't recognize my own voice. Aunt Judith was silent for a second, and then she said the words that tore me apart. He couldn't do it, dear. I'm so sorry. The phone almost fell out of my hand. No, I whispered, but the sound of my own voice seemed alien to me, as if it belonged to someone else. No, I said. This can't be happening. I slowly lowered the phone, as if hoping that if I didn't listen, everything would disappear, everything would turn out to be a mistake, and then maybe this nightmare would end. Mark was standing in the doorway, his face shadowed, but I could feel him staring at me intently. What happened? What is it? He asked softly. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come, as if I'd forgotten how to breathe, and all I could manage was, my dad. He's gone. I didn't have time to say more, because the next moment everything inside me broke down, and I began to sob, shuddering with pain that could not be stifled. It was impossible to control. Mark came over and hugged me, but at that moment I felt that his hugs were not comforting. They seemed like strangers, as if I was being held not by my husband, but by a stranger. I'm sorry, Melina, he said, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but it didn't matter anymore. I was too lost in my grief to hear him. Tired after another long day filled with negotiations with a funeral agency, endless calls, organizing a memorial service and clarifying details, which, as it turned out, are simply not enough in such matters, I returned home earlier than usual, hoping to at least spend a little time in silence, catch my breath, and feel the loneliness that has now become for me the only consolation. But as soon as I put the key in the lock of the front door, muffled voices came from the living room, and I immediately froze, as if instinctively feeling that I should not be heard. I can't live with her anymore. Mark's voice sounded irritated, breaking into annoyance. She's driving me crazy. That's too much. You'll have to wait a bit, Mark, Mary hissed, her voice, usually so gentle and caring, now sounding cold and hard. We need to figure out what to do with those receipts that your father-in-law had. They're at Melina's now. The sooner I get out of this situation, the better, Mark said irritably, and his voice sent an icy chill down my spine. I'll take these receipts and destroy them. And then I'll start all over again, with that rich beauty I told you about. My heart felt as if someone had suddenly squeezed it with an icy hand. I was grieving for my father, trying to cope with grief, with the pain of loss, while the people I considered my family were scheming behind my back, discussing how to get rid of me and keep everything that was a part of my life yesterday. They weren't the loving, caring family I thought I'd become when I married Mark. No, they only saw me as a means to achieve their goals, a way to solve their financial problems, a bargaining chip in their cynical game. Anger and shock mixed in my chest, forming a whirlwind of emotions inside me, but I knew that if I burst into the living room, screamed, and exposed them, I would achieve nothing. They would find a way to turn the situation in their favor, to make me look like a hysterical woman who, having lost her father, loses her mind. So I took a deep breath, gathered all my self-control, straightened my back and, slamming the door loudly, as if I had just entered, broke their conspiracy. "Oh, Melina, you came back early," Mary's sweet, instantly changed voice rang out, her eyes wide open, filled with feigned concern. "How did it go with the funeral, dear?" I could barely manage a smile, even though everything inside me was boiling with rage. "It's all working out," I replied in a flat voice. "Thanks for asking." I saw them glance at each other, briefly but eloquently. They hoped that I hadn't heard anything, that I was still naive, trusting, and driven. But now I knew the truth. I knew that showing my cards right now wasn't going to help me. I should have been smarter. I needed to protect what was mine. I needed to get justice for their betrayal. The funeral was somber, the air was filled with the weight of grief, muffled whispers of condolences, soft pats on the shoulder, comforting but useless words that could not change anything. But when the ceremony came to an end, when people began to disperse, and we returned to Mark's parents' house, the real faces of those with whom I lived began to appear, as if the masks had finally cracked. We gathered in the living room, sipping the warm, already cooled coffee. The atmosphere was tense, but I couldn't figure out if it was because of my presence, or if they just realized that everything would end soon. Mourning, sadness, and it would be possible to return to their true intentions. Mark was sitting in an armchair across from me, absently fingering a spoon, then suddenly grinned, looked up at me and said in a flat, cold voice, "Melina, pack your things. You need to get out of here. I have someone else now. Someone better." Those words were supposed to sound like a blow, like a betrayal that could leave me devastated, but knowing what he'd said about his plans just a few days ago, I was ready. I pretended to be stunned, letting emotions flash across my face as if they had caught me off guard, but before I could respond, Mary intervened, her voice dripping with malice. "We're already tired of you, darling. We only tolerated you because of your money." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "What about the house?" I asked with feigned innocence. "The house I paid for. The $200,000 I invested in it." Mary suddenly laughed, so loudly that her laughter echoed around the room, as if I had just told the best joke of the year. "Oh, honey," she said through her laughter, "this house is ours. You're nobody here." I clenched my fists, keeping myself from letting the rage get the better of me. "But I have confirmation," I said, hoping they didn't know I had these documents. Mark suddenly grinned even wider, his gaze turned cruel, almost triumphant. Those checks you're so proud of. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. We found them at your father's house. My chest tightened with anticipation. And they burned it. My head was spinning. They're gone, he continued, enjoying the effect his words had. For a moment. Mary, Deck, Mark, they were all looking at me, waiting for me to break down. But they didn't know that I already knew their truth. They didn't know that I was already preparing to strike back. I let them believe that they had won. I let them feel the sweet triumph of their imaginary victory, but then, unable to hold back any longer, I burst out laughing, loud, sincere, biting, breaking the silence that filled the living room, in which a moment ago their confidence in their own impunity was hovering. Their faces instantly changed. Mark's smile froze, Mary's lips twitched, and Jack frowned, as if he didn't understand what could have seemed so funny to me. Why are you laughing? Mark snapped irritably, his voice becoming strained, almost harsh. What's so funny? I wiped a tear from the corner of my eye, trying to pull myself together, but light convulsive giggles still escaped from my chest. I shook my head, looking at them with mockery. You're pathetic. Mark clenched his fists, tensed, as if about to respond, but I didn't give him the opportunity. You think you're so smart, don't you? I raised my eyebrows, looking at their confused faces. Did you really think that you burned the only proof? The receipts that you destroyed were copies. The blood drained from their faces instantly, all their self-confidence evaporated in an instant, and it was replaced by the realization that the game they had started was lost before it even began. My lawyer has the real documents, I added with icy calm, watching Mark's gaze twitch as his lips tightened into a thin line, as he desperately tried to think of something, but could not find a way out. You can't prove anything. He muttered, but his voice trembled treacherously, betraying fear. I leaned forward, looking straight into his eyes. I can. And I'll do it, I snapped. There was silence in the room, broken only by Mary's noisy breathing, who clasped her hands on her chest as if she had just been hit. Now I want my money back, I continued. Every last cent otherwise, my next call will be to the police. Mark and Jack exchanged glances, their previous confidence crumbling like a house of cards in a gust of wind. Melina, Jack said hoarsely, his voice suddenly quieter, more humble, almost pleading. Please, let's talk about it. Can we settle this issue somehow? Now the truth had been revealed, and all the trumps were in my hands. The negotiations with Mark and his parents dragged on longer than I expected. They tried their best to find loopholes, tried to bend the terms in their favor, but I wasn't going to give in anymore. I wasn't going to let them take advantage of me again. It's simple, I stated firmly during one of our many discussions at their now legitimately NY kitchen table. The house is being transferred to my name. In exchange, I'm not taking the case to court. I paused, giving them time to realize that they had no other options. That's it, I added, crossing my arms over my chest. No more games. Mark opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again. Mary paled, and Jack sighed heavily. And then I realized they had given up. We all agreed that the best course of action was to make everything official and legal. I insisted that all the documents be drawn up by a lawyer, notarized, and signed in the presence of witnesses. I don't want any misunderstandings, I stressed when we gathered in the lawyer's office, and my words hung in tense silence. I carefully watched every movement, every signature, every document that was passed from hand to hand, and only when all the papers were finalized, only then did I finally allow myself to exhale. After collecting the property transfer documents, I carefully put them in a folder and looked at Mary, who looked depressed, but somehow still retained a hint of the self-confidence that she always had. I'll keep them in a safe place, I said, not taking my eyes off her. She didn't answer, just exhaled sharply, turning away. Mark didn't say a word. The divorce process turned out to be easier than I expected. Mark was calm, almost indifferent, his former arrogance gone as he signed the last documents. When it was all over, I felt like a huge weight was lifted from my shoulders, as if my chest felt freer, lighter, as if I could finally breathe again. The day they moved out, I stood on the porch of my now completely private house and watched Mark, his mother, and his father carry boxes to a rented van. Their movements were slow, their mood was gloomy, and looking at them, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't the end I imagined for my marriage. But under the circumstances, it was the best possible outcome. When everything calmed down, when I was finally alone, when the house was filled with silence again, I realized that for the first time in a long time I felt truly free. I started hearing rumors, from friends, from casual acquaintances, from those who still remembered Mark and his family, but now they were talking about them with a touch of sympathy, not envy, as it used to be. Apparently, the grass on the other side turned out to be not greener at all, but rather scorched by the sun of disappointments and bad decisions, because his mistress, the same rich beauty for whom he so easily betrayed me, left him almost immediately after our divorce, unwilling to share his life difficulties with him, and his parents accustomed to the comfort and coziness of a large house. They were now forced to live in a tiny, rented apartment which they undoubtedly despised, but had to come to terms with the new reality. Karma overtook them faster than I expected, and although I didn't feel the slightest bit sorry for them, I was struck by how predictably their fate turned out. People who are used to living at someone else's expense one day find themselves in a position where there is simply no one left to support them, and then they start to sink. Despite their obvious difficulties, they began contacting me, at first, cautious, timid messages with hints of reconciliation, then more persistent calls, left voicemails, attempts to sneak back into my life, and maybe into my house, but I knew them too well to succumb to this cheap sentimentality. And so, without hesitation, I blocked their numbers, deleted them from all possible social networks, deleting them completely and irrevocably, feeling like with each broken contact I was getting lighter. It was liberating to finally cut the last threads that bound us. One afternoon, when I was enjoying the silence, comfort, and a new novel, having settled down in the living room with a cup of fragrant tea, there was a knock on the door. It was a steady knock, but when I went over and looked through the peephole, I froze when I saw a familiar figure. Mark. He was standing on the porch, looking pathetic and faded, not at all the way I remembered him, not the cocky man who once thought the world belonged to him. He was holding a bouquet of flowers in his hands, as if hoping that this gesture could change something that had long been destroyed. This audacity made me laugh. I opened the door, but not to let him in, more to look him in the face and let him know that he was late. Really, Mark? I grinned, crossing my arms over my chest. Flowers? He shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. The bouquet in his hands seemed to wither along with his confidence, with his arrogance, with that smug grin that once did not leave his face. Melina, he swallowed, as if trying to find the right words. I've realized so many things. I was wrong, terribly wrong. I tilted my head to one side, watching him intently, but in his eyes I saw no regret, no remorse, only fear, the fear of a man who has run out of options, who now stands at a closed door and realizes that he is knocking on the void. Do you remember when you told me that you were disgusted with me? He continued, as if expecting me to say that I had changed my mind. I leaned against the door frame, not hiding the slight amusement that his discomfort caused in me. What has changed, Mark? I asked, carefully examining his face, which was filled with doom. He looked away, as if he hoped that by not looking into my eyes he could hide the truth, but I already knew it. You've run out of options, that's what's changed, I answered for him, shaking my head. He sighed, his shoulders slumped, his face lost the last traces of hope. You're not here to fix everything, Mark, I continued, and my voice sounded calm, even gentle. You just desperately want to get back to your comfortable life. I took a step forward, looking straight into his eyes, and said softly but confidently, "But guess what?" He didn't answer, and then I finished the sentence myself. "This life doesn't exist anymore. Not for you." Mark flinched, as if my words were a physical blow. His lips twitched, as if he wanted to say something, but realized that any words would be useless. "Melina, please." He took a step forward, but I immediately raised my hand, stopping him. "Keep it safe," I cut him off abruptly. "I want you to leave. Don't come back here. We're done here. Forever." He stood there for another second, his lips moving soundlessly, but he still couldn't find what to say, because he knew I wouldn't change my mind. I was no longer someone who was willing to forgive his mistakes. And then he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched under the weight of defeat, his steps slow, as if he didn't want to leave, but he knew he had no other choice. I watched him go, but not with sadness, not with regret, but with a deep sense of completion. After slamming the door, I returned to the living room, sat down in my seat, opened the book and turned the page with a smile. The silence of my house now enveloped me like a cozy blanket, gently, unobtrusively, giving me the feeling of peace that I had dreamed of for so long. A sharp contrast to the chaos that once overflowed here in a torrent, filling every room, every corner, depriving me of freedom, making me feel like a prisoner of other people's desires. But now it's all in the past. I finally found peace, living the way I want, and no amount of apologies, no flowers, or sweet words could change that. I was really, finally, irrevocably free.